Okay, calm down.
But the United States is not able to do what it did. And one of the greatest mistakes empires in the past have made is overreaching when they can't do that anymore. And my fear is we're at a very delicate point in that process, hampered by a denial of what's going on that periodically frightens me.
So if our politicians could get out of the state of denial and face reality, what would that look like? What would this soft landing that you just described look like?
They would have to sit down at this point, either with China or with China and what we call the BRICS, this group of nations that are really working well together, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and Russia. I left out Russia, right. And there's a dozen other countries that have applied. So they're going to become much, much bigger in the next 12 to 24 months. You'd have to sit down with them and work out a live and let live arrangement. You know, the world needs a lot of things produced. Americans can produce some of them, Chinese can produce, and Brazilian. We'd have a much better world if it were more generously distributed. It shouldn't all be in North America and Western Europe. That's a legacy of colonialism we should better put behind us. If more of the different parts of the world really are integrated, they'll be less likely to be tempted to do militarily what they really can't afford. That's already underway. We might have done terrible things vis-a-vis China if we weren't as dependent on the Chinese as we already are. Look, from the time that Kissinger and Nixon went to China and reestablished relations with them several decades ago, until 10 years ago, the United States and China were helping each other. We're trading a lot. That's when a lot of American companies invested in China, et cetera, et cetera. We were able to live together. Those were years of great prosperity in the United States and great economic growth in China. My feeling is, look, we have much to gain and we can avoid a terrible loss. A war? Are we serious? Are we going to have a war around Taiwan, in China, in the South China Sea, at the same time that we're fighting a war in Europe? Really? With countries that all have nuclear weapons? This is crazy. We can't afford to do it, and we ought to stop trying. The wealth of the United States is a great incentive for other countries to meet us halfway. Let's use the wealth to have an attempt at least. Even if we fail, it's worth the effort to try to do this rather than the saber rattling that's scaring everybody in the world and not bringing the United States out of its decline. Its decline continues. You rattle your sword against Russia and China, the situation of the United States has not gotten better. The United States is more isolated now than it was 5 years ago. Russia is not the pariah nation that the United States and Western Europe would like to claim it to be. I'm not arguing whether it's right or wrong. I'm not defending this or any of that. What I'm saying is, let's be honest and look at the situation the way it is. We are fighting to the last Ukrainian, and I don't think that's a smart move at all.
It's certainly not pro-Ukrainian either.
No.
Although that's the discourse, of course.
It's very hard to imagine what in the world Ukraine will be. That's where the level of denial becomes frightening. I mean, the European statistics are that something like 30% of Ukrainians are refugees, left the country. And most of them are never going to go back. Why should they? Their country is destroyed, economically, politically, culturally. The war has moved ever westward from the frontier with Russia. It's not about Russia winning or losing. Everybody loses in this, but the Russians are clearly moving in the direction they were trying to go, and the Ukrainians are trying to convince us that they have succeeded in slowing the Russians from what they were doing. Okay, I mean, let's be honest. We keep escalating the level of weaponry we give them. Is that because they're winning? No, that's because they're not winning, that you have to give them more and more. And there's no sign that the next level of more will be any more successful than the last 6 levels of more. And by the way, there are serious American military people whose patriotism is not in question, who think this is crazy. And periodically, documents are released that show that they're there. The latest issue of Harper's Magazine has a lead article, "Why Are We in the Ukraine?" And the answer the authors give, who are well-known authors, is we can't figure it out. We shouldn't be there. That's the truth of what. And they're not siding with one side or the other. They're saying this is a mistake. We got into this for the wrong reasons at the wrong time, and we misunderstood the resiliency of who we're fighting against, which is a dangerous thing to do if you're fighting against them, because then they're your enemy, and you don't want to make mistakes with your enemy, et cetera, et cetera. All these folks, they're talking, but the folks at the top are now so invested in this policy that you can see they don't want to think about, they don't want to hear. They're just doubling down. It doesn't go well, send bigger weapons. Oh, that didn't work, send even more. Okay, I'd be at a certain point, that's the kind of story that will be told by historians of the future trying to explain why the American empire flamed out so quickly when it could have, like the British or others, had a much less violent, slower, more gradual, less disruptive of people's lives decline.
So, what would this look like for you and me, let's say, both scenarios, the flamed out empire versus the soft landing empire? How does that affect US citizens?
Well, the worst kind of flaming out would be a military confrontation. I have no idea how that works. I don't know whether the people in charge will hold back from nuclear weapons. And if that starts, then who knows? So, I mean, I don't mean to be an alarmist, but it is a life and death matter and will be for significant numbers of people if this kind of confrontation is pursued. We're already paying the price of this. Let me give you 2 examples. Because Russia was not brought to its knees by refusing to buy oil and gas. Russia shifted its oil and gas, as I said, to India and China and others, but those are the 2 big buyers of the Russian exports. Okay, that meant that the previous importer of Russian oil and gas, Western Europe in particular, and Germany, the number 1 economy in Western Europe, relying on Russian oil and gas, they can't get that cheap energy anymore. What does that mean? They have to buy energy in the world market, including liquefied natural gas from the United States. But to produce that gas here, to convert it into liquid, to ship it on tankers over to Europe, means that they're paying 2 to 3 times more for their energy than they used to. Well, what does that mean? It means that the inflation inside Europe is very bad because the higher prices of energy become higher costs to produce everything that takes energy: food, clothing, shelter, all the products of Europe. So, for example, the inflation in Europe right now is north of 10%, double what it is here in the United States, which means the Europeans can't compete with the United States as they normally do. They're being priced out of the market. All over the world, people who used to buy German machines or French luxury goods or Italian furniture or whatever it is are buying American. or Chinese or Brazilian, but they're not buying Europe. You know, let me give you a sign of what it meant, because this is happening in our country too. Our inflation here, which has been very bad for the last 18 months, is also a product of these changes in the global economy coming out of the American-led sanctions war against Russia. Okay, here's an example. The first quarter of this year, the January, February, March, quarter number one of the year 2023, economic growth in Germany, 0%. They didn't grow at all. Their population grew, the needs of their people grew, but their output of goods and services, zero. France, 0.2%. The United States, 1%. The People's Republic of China, 4.5%. Do you understand? China, which has been growing 2 to 3 times faster than the US for 30 years, continues to do that. Western Europe is a disaster, and the United States is somewhere in between. These are very bad comparative numbers. That's hurting the American economy. Everybody who goes into a grocery store and discovers what it costs for a dozen eggs is discovering one of the consequences of an inflationary situation. So desperate is the inflation that our central bank, the Federal Reserve, over the last year has raised interest rates further and faster than at any comparable time in American history, meaning that everybody's credit card debt is going through the roof. Anybody imagining going to college is going to be facing higher costs of doing that. Ditto to buy your car, ditto to buy a home. I mean, we are facing rising costs that are directly connected. It's not the only cause, but this war in the Ukraine, this effort kind of desperately to hold on to a declining empire, because that's what's behind all of this, is costing us in countless ways. Today's Bloomberg, I read the financial press every day. Today's Bloomberg has a lead headline that the consensus of economists is a recession is coming here later this year or early next, and it will cost, here's their number, 3.4 million jobs will be lost here in the United States. There's a cost. That's 10, 20 million people that are going to be suddenly without income, having to join the unemployed, with all that means in terms of your self-esteem, your feeling, your relationships with your spouse, with your children, with your community. The costs here they're all over the place once you ask what's going on and you see the connections. Yes, the government doesn't want you to because it doesn't want to get the blame for its policies. I understand that. And you have the cheap shots of the Republicans who want to get in and do what the Democrats are already doing, and so attack them for it. You know, it's childish. That's why you were right to talk about it being theater. But it's not theater in the sense that it's all a play, because it really affects all of us directly and indirectly in our daily lives. And I think we're going to be very sorry. The American working class, if you allow me, has really been put through the ringer. Over the last 30 to 40 years, the real wage, the amount of money an average worker gets, adjusted for the prices that average worker has to pay, has been stagnant. Hadn't gone up, hadn't gone down. It just sits. That's very strange in American history. For the previous 150 years, real wages and what we could afford to buy went up. That's a trauma to put a working class that has gotten used to American exceptionalism, to the notion that every generation will live better than the one before, that your parents will see you have a more comfortable life, and you in turn with your children. And all of that's gone, been gone for 30 years, causing all kinds of havoc. Then we have the crash of 2000. the so-called dot-com crash. Then we have the even worse crash of 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis. Then we have the third crisis in 2020 before COVID hits, and then made worse by the pandemic. And look, you want to see another measure of the decline of the United States? We are 4.3% of the world's population, we Americans. And we suffered 16% of the world's deaths from COVID. A rich country, a dominant United States, that's a big F for failure to manage a public health emergency. What's going on? Why do we have these things? These are fundamental questions that ought to be on the top of everybody's agenda. That soft versus hard landing you asked about, that should be what we're talking about. We should hear what our leaders offer in the way of a response to that existential crisis. No, we don't. Instead, we're trying to fight an election based on what kind of bathroom trans people may be allowed to utilize. Talk about denial. It's a level of denial that is frightening because it's so close to pathology.